All right, welcome everybody to TagOne's inaugural webinar. We're going to give it probably another minute or two before we dive deep into some of the content here. Just a quick overview on what we're going to do and introduction to the system. If you haven't used Zoho's webinar software before, on your left you should see a Q&A button, polls as well, and I think there's an area where you can raise your hand. So throughout the presentation, I'll be asking at various times just to get your feedback and answer some polls. Will help us understand where different people sit in their perspectives or where they're at in the transparency journey. And then if we've got time, hopefully the goal is to have about 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you've got questions, just type them in along the way and we'll get to those at the end. My brain's not big enough or smart enough to stop in the middle and kind of ask questions and continue on, but just ask them in the Q&A section, type them in, and then I'll read them aloud and we'll answer them at the end of the session if we have some time there. So, Len, do we have you on the line? Len is here. He's going to unmute, and then we will probably get started in just a moment. All right, Len, do we have you? Len, you there? Len.
Hello. Sorry, I was having some audio problems.
No problem. So, all right, quick introduction. My name is Joe Witte. I'm the VP of Ecosystems and Partnerships here at TagOne. And we've got Len Monheit with us here. Excited to have you, Len. And we're going to talk about how best practices in blockchain are delivering dietary supplement transparency. It's quite a lot to cover for sure. Len, tell us a little bit about yourself. For those of you that don't know Len, he's a passionate guy. He's been in the industry for a long time, wearing a lot of different hats, from regulatory to media components. Tell us what drove yourself and the company to start Trust Transparency Center and what your vision is for the company.
Absolutely. First of all, it's great to be on this webinar with you, Joe. Thanks for the opportunity. My background is chemistry, biochemistry, and prior to getting into the natural products industry, I was running a contract analytical lab and saw varying degrees of quality and competency throughout the industry back in the late 90s. Did get into the media side and did a lot of focus on ingredients and supply chain. Over the course of the last couple of years, I've joined my business partner, Scott Steinford, in Trust Transparency Center. And as the name implies, everything we do is focused on trust transparency. We say trust transparency, not trust and transparency, because they're interwoven, they're synergistic, and transparency leads to that holy grail, which is consumer trust and trust in ourselves as an industry. So we are driving towards that in any of our operations, whether those are the ingredient associations we operate or the practices and the processes we get involved with companies.
Awesome. So what we want to do before we get started is just talk about what we're going to talk about today. So a lot of different topics. One, what are some of the major supply chain issues in the industry? How do these issues creep into our businesses and what are the problems they can cause? What is transparency? There's a lot of talk about that and why we should consider being more transparent in our businesses. What internal best practices we can integrate to minimize risk and improve efficiency. What this whole blockchain thing is and how it can impact us. A little bit about our software solution, general about what software is and how they can help us and change behaviors and avoid mistakes, and ultimately how supply chain transparency can differentiate a company in the market. So diving right in, on the left you guys should see a poll. I want to ask you guys, if you could answer the first two questions, how important is supply chain and product transparency to your organization at this time? And maybe what stage your company is at also. So I'm going to start the first two. Great. And I don't know if you guys can see the results, but it looks like, 4.8. Most companies, it's either 4 or 5 stars. It's really important to you guys. Now I'm going to start the second poll, which is what stage you guys are at in integrating supply chain transparency. So as we're going through this poll, Len, what do you see as the current state of the dietary supplement industry? What are some of the growth opportunities and some of the key challenges?
Well, I think this poll is interesting in that companies realize it's important, but their efforts are a little bit lagging. I think it's really, really challenging to understand, and every company is on its own transparency journey. We've got new regulations that are enforced erratically. We've got very complex supply chains. We've got data handling capabilities that are increasing, but it's burdensome. So, there's a lot to wrestle with if you're a company within the industry, whether you're a manufacturer, contract manufacturer, or a brand, or even a supplier. You've got a lot of things you're wrestling with as you take on this nebulous concept of transparency. But it is a journey, and every company's on their own journey.
And I know that there is one statistic we were talking about before about just how many brands there are on, let's say, Amazon, and how a lot of them are just flat out aren't meeting label claim. What kind of challenges does that present to the industry as a whole? And so you may have some good companies out there that are doing it right, like how to combat that.
Well, I think that you're right. There's companies that have been around of all sizes that are doing it exceptionally well. They've got this down. One of the things that the internet has done is it created another low barrier to entry with regulations and with expectations for consumers. We had started to raise the bar on entry in the industry, but the internet has lowered that bar, and a company could go to business being ignorant of really what they need to do in order to comply. We've also got the issue of a company can go to market without physically touching their product. It can be produced and it could be stored for them. They don't know what their responsibilities are. But these are opportunities because with a little tweaking, they can get it right. And the technology capabilities for them to get it right are emerging on the scene.
Yeah, I think it's right. I think it's encouraging. There are opportunities to grow. I think another area that's really challenging for the industry as a whole is just the complexity of supply chain. When you look at how many different players are in that process from start to finish, and like you said, somebody whose name may be on a bottle may not even see the ingredients or product before it ends up in the consumer. How complex is this process, and how much is the complexity, do you feel like, contributes to some of the, negative, feelings and sentiments towards dietary supplements today?
Well, I'll start with the data point. And Nutrition Business Journal and Next recently arrived at a number of about 40% under 40% of consumers trust supplements. I think that there's other polls that show it a little bit better. This slide that you're seeing right now is a simplified dietary supplement supply chain. There is so much more going on and so many touch points, and that's a tough story to tell. But it is a story to tell because you can get an ingredient from one corner of the world, an excipient from another, a harvested product from Americas, and various processing and aggregating steps that all lead to that bottle that a consumer gets. There's a huge opportunity to be able to tell that story about that complexity, but this complexity makes it challenging. And you'll see that right in the middle there is that contract manufacturing box, and that's problematic because most brands have very limited visibility back through the supply chain, through that contract manufacturing step, and most raw material companies are not necessarily the right part of the equation as product gets aggregated and brought into contract manufacturing. And even if you're a branded ingredient, you can get displaced by a decision that's made at procurement. So it's challenging both ways in the supply chain.
And just to even add to that, knowing that it's a global supply chain, now the FDA has implemented the FSBP policy, what kind of pressure do you see that's going to put on companies? Is it significant? And how do they need to improve their process in order to manage the FSBP policy?
Well, FSB, the Food Safety Modernization Act is mostly about managing risk and identifying the risks in your supply chain and of your suppliers. The FSBP program focuses on foreign suppliers, which means that part of the supply chain is not exempt. So there are inspections that are happening both internationally and domestically. The expectations of the FDA are increasing. You have this under control and appropriately risk managed. But there are companies, despite the fact that compliance for all companies is mandated as of last year, there are companies that are still negligent in this area. There are companies that are still figuring it out. And FDA has not been very prescriptive. They've just said you have to have the plan, and it has to address these safety issues, including allergens. There will be increasing pressure to have a good system in place that seamlessly handles your supply chain, especially your foreign suppliers.
Yep, and I mean, you touched upon with that, what is motivating transparency? How do you define transparency today, Len, as it applies to supply chain management?
Well, like I said, every company is on their own transparency journeys. It depends on where you start, some of your legacy, some of your history. Transparency is disclosing some things that may be uncomfortable in the interest of satisfying the increasing need of your supply chain partners, underlying partners, to do better, longer-term, more viable and successful business with you so that consumers will trust your products at the end.
Sure. So you talked a little bit about the FDA's role in hey, we just need to be better in our supply chain process to deal with policies, whether it's state attorneys general or FDA. But you touched a little bit, but talk a little more about how consumers are fitting into this transparency model.
Well, there's been a lot of negativity about some of the big businesses, whether that's bank data breaches, Volkswagen, and their emissions manipulation. So all of these are leading to an overall of distrust. And then I think that there is this, where do you get your information? Can you trust the internet? I mean, we've heard the litany of fake news. You can manipulate headlines, and consumers are finding it increasingly difficult to discern what is trustworthy, but they're expecting, demanding, and getting better information because it's very difficult, it's increasingly difficult to keep things hidden, keep skeletons hidden. These things will out.
Yeah, and so when consumers don't trust a whole industry, that's bad for everybody, right? And so what we're going to talk about predominantly today is that operational efficiency, and now with new technologies and capabilities, how we can start to differentiate, hey, these are the good brands, here's how we can prove it, right? And these are the ones that maybe aren't as sophisticated or just flat out don't care. So, Len, a little bit on, you guys have got your scoring system with your company, Trust Transparency Center. What do you see as the major enhancers, like why companies are moving towards transparency?
Well, first of all, 20 years in this industry, or 25, I'm a strong advocate for the industry and really love some of the best practices. And we at Trust Transparency have built a scoring system, a Trust Transparency scorecard, which talks about operational aspects, but also cultural aspects, which we figure are important in the dietary supplement industry, but in industry generally. So we start to think about enhancers of transparency and trust, okay? This is an industry with solid recent growth, solid projected growth. We have users, we have believers. These are people that are a committed audience that wants our product and wants the personalized approach. I can take control of my health. They're engaged.
Yep.
We've also got amazingly vibrant and valuable stories. We've got legacy. We've got sourcing from farmers from far off. We've got mission and purpose-driven companies. We've got passion in entrepreneurs, passion in staff, passion when it comes to lobbying. We're also very well poised to be part of the e-commerce movement. Going online and being able to sell online is extremely powerful, and it's reaching consumers where they are. They're online. And we're part of that health and wellness dialogue. We're doing good for society and good for people. So these are all the enhancers we have as an industry.
And what are some companies that are doing it right?
Well, I mean, I could probably list 10, 12, 14, but of recent, and one goes back maybe 15 years in their program, I would say Gaia Herbs in the Know Your Herbs program was one of the first to really go back and track the lot numbers and the harvest and field conditions of some of the herbs and botanicals within their product line. Yep. So that's a good example. Another example, a little bit more recently, would be Mega Food. And part of their transparency initiative was actually to put cameras on their manufacturing operation so that there was visibility and transparency on their process and manufacturing. So those are two examples right within the industry.
Yeah, and we spoke to the leadership at Sabinza and just how they're focused on sustainability, working with the farmers, giving them fair prices. There's a lot of it's like when I came out of the expo out west, Natural Products Expo out west, I actually came encouraged that there's a lot of companies that really care. So I think that there's going to be this shift in movement as it's just really about letting the consumers know which ones care and which ones maybe don't. And I think we're probably pretty close to that. And kind of on that, what are some of the challenges to integrating transparency and the detractors?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got very opaque supply chains. There's a little bit of a black box and a definite opacity at contract manufacturers. Sometimes third-party testing labs, that's an island of information, and companies may not vet or even have third-party analytical labs doing their work. We definitely get involved in hyperbole when it comes to our claims, and that leads to distrust. There's this general distrust of corporation, the fake news aspect that I spoke of a little while ago. We've got a very convoluted regulatory environment. It's not pharma, it's not food, it's deliberately not that way. And that gets misspoken, misrepresented, and so that ambiguity doesn't necessarily always stand in our support. And where our detractors are, they're extremely vocal.
Yep, that makes sense. And so, in order to help companies that want to move towards this transparency, you guys developed a checklist. And of course, this is just you guys have a very thorough process. Talk about what drove this and how this is helping companies start to take a look at themselves in their process to become, better and more efficient, more transparent.
Yeah, so the background to this is the understanding that there are 15,000 plus brands on Amazon, 160,000 SKUs. There are new companies that don't have the background and the engagement with the industry that some of the legacy companies have, and that a company can go to market without physical presence in brick and mortar, and that there are things that are absolutely fundamental that are contained within the regulations, but there's no real how-to for the industry and some of these entrepreneurs. So that led us to develop this checklist, and there's about 15, 16 items. Most of them are very logical. If you think about it, they're not being complied with in many cases because there's general ignorance, and these companies either want to take a quick path to market, or they really don't know that these are expectations and behaviors and accountabilities. So that led to the development of this list.
Okay.
We know that there's shortcuts being taken. We know that there's great contract manufacturers being used. We also know that there are ones that are taking the shortcuts to bring a lower product to market, lower price product.
Yep, that makes sense. And so when you're starting to talk to these companies or you have relationships with a lot of them, what do you think is the main reason that drives them to be more transparent? And I'm going to also poll the audience on that now. So I'm going to start that poll. What's driving your company? So what are you seeing, Len, as people are answering the question?
So I think that the more complicated the supplier's supply chain, they need ways of organizing it, but it also contributes to their story. The brands that want to differentiate, that want to attract that emerging supplement buyer, know that it's knowing what ingredients are in your products, knowing how products are prepared and produced, how they're grown. So there's an emerging population of supplement consumers that expect to know and to be able to see that information. So I think brands are strongly positioning around that. And then as number two says, there's companies that just recognize that it's the right thing to do, and there's data that shows that trust and intangibles is leading to increased market valuations. So there's a direct correlation, and that's part of the ROI. Market capitalization is being driven by financial performance, sure, but it's also these intangibles.
That makes sense. So when we look at the operational component of being transparent, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. We talked about, meeting FDA, FSVP standards, i.e., hey, you got to check the box and make sure we're not getting in trouble with Big Brother. There's just a lot of documentation and data, especially with all the certifications that come around. Everything that's like, oh, this is going to make it so much easier, rarely is. If you've got 100 different SKUs or even 10 different SKUs, how many different ingredients that may go into that. It can get complex fast, and then you're tracking transactions in and out, who's buying, who's selling, who are your suppliers, who are your suppliers, where did that come from, ultimately to make a product safe. And then at the end, like, all right, well, how are we going to get all these people on our team, whether you're a 10-person team or a 500 or 5,000-person team, squared away to manage this process? Do you think it's unrealistic to expect companies to get this and execute this flawlessly, or can this be done?
I think it can be done. I think in the past it was haphazard despite the best of intentions. Mm-hmm. I think that with converging technologies, it's now feasible, and I think FDA and others are recognizing that it should be the expectation.
Right.
You talked about two aspects there. You've got reams and reams of information and documentation. Systems are set up for that. Then you've got the data handling, processing, that aspect of it that's going to trigger your actions and your subsequent processes. I think connecting those two areas, companies haven't figured out generally, but the expectation in general is that companies will have this under control.
And so, you mentioned, hey, is there technologies that can help people, right? Now, even at our company, and we provide, advisory services to help people get ready to integrate the technologies we've developed, but we recognize that tech is going to drive the behavior. So, Len, what software solutions do you see most companies using when they want to track their suppliers, ingredients, documents? How are companies managing it today to cobble it together, or some of them building their own? What are you guys seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of reading from the answers there are many companies in the small to mid-size range that are still operating on spreadsheets, groups of spreadsheets, and file management systems to organize their documentation. Mm-hmm. Many have done some proprietary things. Others, the larger companies that are already invested with ERP solutions, are making those ERP systems work to support regulatory compliance. And that's not necessarily those that are built for it, and it gets very, very complicated. Some others have their own cloud-based systems. There are other technology providers, something like the Dietary that's now Trace Games. We're seeing some presence in the marketplace for that. And there's others that are really just trying to figure it out. And then there are the blockchain type of solutions that we're seeing in other industries where that supply chain transparency imperative is being driven. One of the aspects that should be mentioned is that recalls and recall management is a part of the good manufacturing practice requirements. And I did see some data last week that a company that was involved in a recall had gone from several days to several minutes through the capabilities of modern technology.
That's awesome. I'll kind of give show the result of that poll real quick to you guys. And so when we look at everything we have to consider when we're building, selecting, or buying a different software platform and developing this process around that with our team, whether it's a spreadsheet or not, because sometimes, listen, if you're just starting off, you're going to start with what you can afford and what you're doing. Using some cloud-based spreadsheet in Google Drive or something else may be what we have. But we're looking at document master data management. We're looking at ingredient quality management, central regulatory repository information, transaction inventory, as well as ingredient traceability. And you touched upon it, recalls and returns, all are just part of the industry. So, when our team started to look at, hey, we want to build a solution, we based that on, working for, our execs, and many of our team members worked for close to a decade at SAP and have been doing track and trace consulting for, big major companies, J&J, Roche, AmerisourceBergen. We worked really closely with this industry, the dietary supplement and natural products industry, to say, hey, what are the special needs and unique requirements that are unique to this industry that are going to need a platform that can meet its expectations? And the blockchain technology isn't all that old. I mean, you're only talking a couple years old, and it's a lot of buzz, and it's new. So what I want to talk a little bit about is what is blockchain and how it can actually help, of course, the industry as a whole, but also individual companies. So, blockchain, ultimately, it's a kind of encrypted, decentralized digital ledger, right? So think about, if you're going to type a piece of data in and it can capture any type of data, it's going to associate this with, I think it's like a 27-digit code. And anytime, you change a period, you change a sentence, you change a word, or change that documentation, that code will change, and it'll show when and where and who changed that code. So it's basically immutable, going to encrypt all your information so that it's locked down. What I want to do is make sure that people know what blockchain isn't. Blockchain is not cryptocurrency. We often talk about Bitcoin and associate with blockchain. Somehow they become synonymous. They're not. Bitcoin has blockchain technology built into it, but they're not the same. So that's why probably one of the best case studies for using blockchain is in supply chain management. Hey, how can I track what's been passed from one company to the next? Hey, here's what I gave you. Here's what we received, and now you've got this ledger that's going to track that. So some of the key benefits around this is auditability, tight record keeping, and going to ensure that there's no data tampering and information integrity. And sometimes, listen, I mistype emails all the time, right? And I'll go back and read emails man, I can't believe I said that, but this just makes sure that things are pure. So another misnomer about blockchain technology, I spoke to one leader, and he's like, man, why would I put all my information in the blockchain? It's public. Everybody's going to see it. Well, no, there's different types of blockchains. There is a public blockchain. I believe Bitcoin is public, where people can see the transactions that are occurring and taking place. But there's a private blockchain, which is what TagOne is, which means it's permission-based. Your enterprise owns it. You control it. You can control who can see and what they see. But at the end, it's auditable, and it's immutable for you guys internally. Then you may have a consortium blockchain, which is several companies or organizations working together with permissions. So I just want to clear that up. So specifically for the natural products industry, what this does is, of course, it drives accountability. We talked about that accountability and transparency specifically with the supply chain. Man, I've got this ingredient of this dietary supplement. Now I know where this came from and what's in it specifically. So companies that are willing to share, or invest a lot in their dietary supply chain products, now that can get to the consumer. So, Len, from your perspective, how do you see this technology benefiting the industry and the end consumer?
Well, I want to go and maybe narrate a little bit of a personal story. At the beginning of February, I went to West Africa. I went to Ghana on a search for an ingredient. And I found that ingredient on a mountaintop 3 hours north of Accra. And it was a village at the end of the highway, and we were able to meet with a couple of the farmers. And the farmer that we spoke with, took us down to her plot of land, showed us her process, and then we met with the village chief, and we were able to understand that this village had been producing this ingredient for 400 or 500 years, no real commercial. They wanted to maintain the integrity, some of the challenges that they had occurred. At its very simplest, having that story told through the ingredient, through the processing, through to a finished product that incorporates material that's grown on this woman's farm in Ghana, I think is a huge consumer win.
Yep, absolutely. And I think consumers want to know. We want to see, and here's a visualization, using Turmeric. We've developed a mobile application where it's very simple to use, where growers and farmers can capture information from the seed level and put in information like water and harvest time and seed information, up to 49 attributes, which can be modified for our partner. And down below, I gave an illustration, which is like a little block. Like, hey, okay, there's a block of information, then they pass that on, or that's captured into our mobile solution. Our desktop solution, where the processor may put in their information and it's processed and it's passed on to the importer and the manufacturer. All that information is connected to ultimately create that end-to-end transparency that we all want to see. Now, I'm going to get into it in a second, but it's usually going to start with this manufacturer, right, or the brand, and they start with one up, one down. Hey, who's my buyer? Who's my supplier? And how can I just track that a little bit better? But now you see all these blocks of information connecting to connect those dots. And it's going to take time. We don't want to like let everybody know like, hey, you're going to invest in this supply chain transparency model, and it's going to happen in a couple months. We're going to start, what I'm going to talk about in a second is like just getting your master data clean and how important that can be. But Len, as an industry expert, when you look at this graphic, how do you see this potentially impacting and benefiting the industry as a whole?
Well, I think that people that are on a standardized system like this raises the bar of expectations and puts in place some expectations of entry and participation. I think that there's benefits to recall. I think there's benefits to the checks and quality, the identification of the third-party contractors, gathering the information, and just having that authority. I think it becomes technologies like this are going to create a differentiation between the players that are anticipating the consumer need 10 years from now and those that are just sort of riding a wave of popularity. I think it's a differentiator.
Definitely. So, this is a quick screenshot of what we call TagOne Harvest, which is our farmer app. And man, your story about the farmer in Ghana is just really powerful, because now we can empower the growers who are, and honestly, they're the most important person in this process, right? At the end, it's about the growers and the consumers. How do we tighten that up? And then all you folks that are working so hard to do things the right way, to like, as one of our clients says, to unlevel the playing field. Right now, when I look at a shelf, it all looks the same to me. How can I scan a product to say, wait, where did this come from, right? So I think ultimately that's, like, this tool here is going to capture it. And now we're going to get into probably what is not all that sexy of a component, but really important and hard to do, which is that operational process, which is the topic today, and technology that can drive that process. So one of them we get into is master data. And we talk about capturing data. Like, there's not a whole lot of things that are a whole lot more boring, but so important in what we're doing, which is simple things like just having a clean list of our suppliers and buyers. And you think, well, of course, that shouldn't be a problem, Joe. Well, we worked with one of our clients, and they had around 700 different suppliers on a spreadsheet and in a database. After we helped them clean it up, there's a lot of redundancy. Some may be written like it with ink, or another one may not have it. Some may have old addresses that they moved from one to another, which is problematic. And then some of them they don't do business with anymore, or have expired certificates. So after we cleaned that up, it was down to 200 different suppliers they're working with. The other one area, which is like getting your own products and SKUs cleaned up in one centralized area. And the third is ingredients. And Len, this is an area you're an expert in. Talk about just how challenging and tricky having a clean list of ingredients that you're working with in your own company can be.
Well, and I know that we've got a couple of botanicals experts that are listening in, and you got trade names, commodity names, botanical names, brand names, alternative names, so that standardization of data is absolutely imperative in order to really understand what you're making and what's going into the products. The verification process is another area. There's examples in the industry when a product, an ingredient goes out of stock and companies don't have a recourse that's ready to go for an alternative ingredient. Obviously, you want to substantiate, you want to support the ones that are proprietary, that you're basing your science and your claims on, but there you need to make sure your nomenclature is accurate and that you've got the proper inventory flows. So this ingredient standardization, this integrity at the ingredient level is absolutely an imperative.
What are some things that companies can do? Like, all right, whether they're on a spreadsheet or an ERP, you talk about all the different nomenclatures. What are some processes you would recommend that they integrate in order to keep an ingredient list clean?
Well, I guess it would be the cross categorization. So you're always going back to the appropriate fundamental name. Mm-hmm. You've got to make sure you're attributing your brand and IP, so you've got to have that properly categorized. You've got to have your suppliers verified by ingredients, or you've got to make sure if it's a single source ingredient that you've got the communications pathway that you'll never run out of supply, or that they're updating information on technology and or applications on an ongoing basis if those applications do change. You need to have all those things in place.
And I mean, you talked about, supplier verification. So specifically, you shared an anecdote before. Well, what if a company runs out of stock, right? So talk a little bit about how many companies may respond, because that can be challenging, the kind of problems that can occur from that.
Well, the worst case scenario is that the company adulterates. Hopefully that doesn't happen too often. There are outliers, and that's not really good for the industry, the category, or consumers. The worst part about this is that if you are forced to discontinue a product, I mean, it's tough enough to get consumers to comply, repeat purchase. There's a lot of work that goes into that. You suddenly have to discontinue a product because you've got a shortage of supply. That's horrific for your market, for your business opportunity, especially if it's a large product.
So something that we've integrated into our solution is, granted, our platform can be customized depending on the size of the company and also for different roles within the organization. But one area of risk is you have one person, they're scrambling to find an ingredient, they pick up the phone, they call, it gets delivered. Like, how to alleviate and have a workflow process so that way, hey, let's go into TagOne, let's invite a potential partner, what we call a prospect, to join the company. They log in, they put in all the required information that you need, all the documentation, and now there's a workflow that another individual is going to review that and approve that or reject that and say, here's other information we need. So that way, going through having like a process to go through that approval can eliminate just kind of what we call in the military, pencil whipping something in order to get it done fast because it's urgent, which could cause issues down the road. How important do you see having, whether it's with a platform like ours or not, having a workflow and standard operating procedures integrated to verify partners?
Any legitimate company needs a solution for this. That's an absolute imperative. Otherwise, the risks are too great. It's just bad business practice. You need a system to manage this. And there's a requirement, the checklist requirement from the 16 items earlier, that supplier verification process protocol, we've identified it as a priority. It's not the contract manufacturer's responsibility. It's the brand's responsibility as well. It obviously impacts the contract manufacturers, but you can't be in business on a sustainable basis without that system.
So another area that companies challenge is documentation. So, Len, how important is having documents organized in a centralized area, both from, having to share this with the FDA, internally, executives, like how important is document management within an organization?
It is absolutely critical, and it's tougher and tougher with the various regulations and implications and certs and seals and allergens and all of those things. But it's another one of those right ways to do the business, but it's also a regulatory requirement that you have a system that allows you to track your risks. And when you're preparing for an FDA audit, the expectation is that you're going to have information accessible very readily. You also want to shorten the time of an audit so that they're in and out. The more time that they're on site, the more opportunity, frankly, that they can find other things to investigate and deeper aspects of the operation to query. If you can be efficient and accurate, it's going to make that entire audit experience go much better.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word audit probably is worse than the word dentist. I think people automatically get kind of tense with like, oh my goodness, and you don't really know what's going to happen. So, I mean, having everything organized is certainly critical. And so, here we see, there's going to be expirations, right? So different certificates and validations are going to expire at some point in time. You and I were talking a little bit before about kind of an expiration date management plan. Like, how would you recommend companies manage, expiration management, and what are some challenges in doing that seem seemingly basic?
Well, I mean, the easiest is making sure you have a homegrown database with alerts and a nice, clear user interface. That's probably the price of entry, because expiration date is another one of those fundamentals. Practically, companies are operating from spreadsheets. There's no alerts built into their systems, and things can go awry. When we were, as Trust Transparency, doing some product testing, on some random lots, we had expired material that could have been purchased because companies don't necessarily have full control over that, but also products can fail label claim because they're over their expiry date, so you get into a whole mess. So having this is imperative.
So, we were talking before that it would be pretty basic for a company to put everything in a spreadsheet, and even the danger of a spreadsheet, which is who has access to that. Does somebody put in a wrong date? Like, it's easy to put 2018 versus 2019, and then who has visibility on, hey, if somebody on your team is using that spreadsheet and they leave the company, they're sick, they go to maternity leave or something of that nature, well, how can somebody else see, hey, this is expiring soon, to give you a heads up? And I think those are some variables that we put into our system. Hey, what are some data analytics to tell us what's coming down the pipeline? Like, hey, this is going to expire in 3 months. We need to act today. And by the way, here's your tasks and approvals in order to eliminate some of those mistakes or things that were really important to us that we wanted to integrate. So, getting into another area that can be really complex are the transactions, shipments coming in. There's manufacturing that's going to occur, i.e. transformation with all these different ingredients, and then you're going to ship it out. So, Len, I imagine that one area that companies lose a lot of visibility is that all these lot numbers, like they're all different systems, is once you start to blend and manufacture something, like how would you recommend companies manage that transformation process in order not to lose visibility from when it's an ingredient to it's a product on the other side?
Well, at a fundamental, really good filing systems, but it's more than that. And again, you're now talking contract manufacturers and processors and all of the people in between from an ingredient in a field to a finished product on a shelf. Very convoluted, and the more automated the process, the more streamlined the process, the more foolproof the process, it's going to enable that proper tracking, which is really going to impact your recall times.
Yep, excellent. So knowing that it's complex, our team put together, hey, all right, you've got the clean master data, right? All your suppliers are approved, all your ingredients are squared away and approved, all the locations have the right certification. So when a transaction occurs, it's much easier to say, hey, here's what we received. All right, you're going to put all the ingredient supplier information in there, and it's all in a drop down to make it very simple. All the proper certifications, COAs, are dropped in there, and then which can be done both on a desktop or mobile device as well. And then when it comes to the manufacturing portion, hey, we can only pull from ingredients that exist, right? And it only exists if we store that information in our database in TagOne already. Now we know it's going to also give us indications about what are we running out of. If we only have 100, kilograms of turmeric and we just used 90, there's only 10 left. We can't manufacture with 50. It just doesn't exist in the system. So then we're also pulling from different lot numbers to track those lot numbers throughout this whole process. So all this is going to be able to connect to where did it come from, what happened to it, and where did it go. And that leads to our next, and all this is blockchain enabled, right? So that leads to our next slide, which is really the power of TagOne, which is our visual map. Hey, now we can see visually who is our supplier, what's the transaction date, what's the lot number, what's the product, where did it go in the location, all in one visual map where you can click on any one of these, and it's going to expand and give you more information. So when you look at this visual map, Len, what do you think this can do in an audit? And also, hey, I want to have a partnership with a new customer. Hey, Mr. Customer, let me show you how we operate. What does that do, and how does that change the game for somebody, Len?
Yeah, so we'll start with the audit. I think being able to map this visually and traceability all the way up the supply chain, I think is going to make a very favorable impression. I don't know that it's going to close the audit right there, but it's going to show you that the ducks are in a row and that the manufacturing is buttoned up and that the documentation is there and the proper assignments and accountabilities are there. If I am a brand and I'm looking at this, I'm going to feel pretty confident, but I'm also going to look to my contract manufacturer. Seems like I'm picking on them. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of really great contract manufacturers out there, but if they're able to show me this, I'm going to be theirs for life. If I'm a manufacturer or a brand and I'm looking to suppliers and they've got this control and they've identified how they source, harvest, aggregate, process with this type of detail, it's going to give me some confidence. So I think this type of technology will give a lot more security along the supply chain, a lot more trust along the supply chain, ultimately more value in the partnerships along the supply chain.
So one thing that this system can do is you can see, of course, like the visual map or create a kind of a standard view. And this is something that you may print out and hand. Hey, from the FDA, they come and do an audit. Let me print it and hand it to you. You don't necessarily want to give them full access to your system, but they're in, they're going to look, and they're going to out. So there's no question that something like this should streamline. You talk about have an audit. It could be done in seconds or minutes rather than take a whole lot of time. And oftentimes in ed business, especially this one, there's incidents that occur, right? It could lead to a recall or return. What are some best practices that companies need to keep in mind and implement when it comes to recalls and returns?
Well, the biggest thing I would say for any level of the supply chain is do a practice run and do it on one of your most complicated products so that you are prepared and you know where your own weakest link is. And that would be the guidance and advice. So I would actually walk through the system, laborious as it might be, but do that no matter what infrastructure platform technology you're using. Obviously, technology is a facilitator. I mentioned earlier that our recall was able to be executed in trackability, executed in moving from days to minutes. I don't know if that's the absolute expectation, but there's going to be more demand on that immediate activity, so the systems need to support that demand.
I was reading an article, I think it was published by Deloitte, and said like a standard recall and return for like a major enterprise, right, could cost them with hard costs and soft costs like millions of dollars. Like it just be really, really expensive. So having, and that probably doesn't even include all the time invested in that. So having, they're expensive, right? And sometimes it's just going to occur. But how do you minimize time, pain, frustration? I would imagine if it's not something that's not keeping the sea level up at night, it should be. So when we look at that visual map we created, this recall and return system we built in there just makes it so much more seamless, where we've got templates built in, and now you can recall and return from the right people, right? You don't need to recall everything from everybody because you don't know. You can recall from the right people. You know exactly who has that lot number, where did it go, and that keeps people safe, consumers safe, and keeps businesses running efficiently, which is just an absolutely huge benefit to any organization. So, and this is kind of just some quick screenshots about our platform and how it can work and having this templates built in. So ultimately, we've built in, of course, a lot of analytics. I'm not going to read these to you guys. You guys can read through these real quick, but giving whether it's somebody who's heading up a supply chain process or a head of operations, somebody who's on the regulatory side, giving them the data information at their fingertips every single day and knowing what they need to do in some of these different areas. Len, what kind of information, when you look at this, these data points, how much can this impact somebody who's leading these departments at a supply chain or COO or even CEO? How does it change their job?
Well, I think it changes the risk equation, I think, because it forces some tough questions and very, very streamlined processes that manage a lot of exposure and risk. I think the unknown is how valuable this gets to the consumer and to the brand. And that becomes down to that intangible ROI. If I'm working with a company, if I'm buying from a company that can show me this is what they've got buttoned up, and these are the aspects of operations, quality control, and regulatory compliance, it becomes a differentiator in the marketplace, which I think does reflect in repeat purchases on store shelf.
Something else, because you and I, we love to talk about how to run and operate businesses and entrepreneurship and agility. Imagine you bring on a new team member, right? You've built this all out. You got a new team member. How much easier it would be to onboard somebody once you've developed that culture, those values, and these systems? Say, hey, here's our system. You're going to follow A, B, C, D, E, versus maybe a much looser spreadsheet system. I can imagine just going to streamline, personnel, build a culture in. I think it should have a huge impact there too. But kind of going on to what you're talking about, like, all right, now companies have done and integrated all this hard work to develop supply chain transparency. Historically, supply chain and product really had nothing to do with each other. It's kind of two totally different worlds. And now, because the way we're so interconnected within our company, without our company, with consumers, supply chain now has become a strange bedfellow with the marketing team, where good marketing professionals are saying, wait, guys, you guys are working so hard to build a transparent process. Now let's bring that to our consumer. So that's why we developed our mobile app called TagOne Connect, which can share, hey, track and traceability of a product, beyond the label information, product safety, if you want to insert certificates, social connect, expert information, supplement facts, all this information. So, how can evidence, now you've got evidence of this end-to-end transparency, how do you think that can impact customer confidence in a product and how they may choose one product over another?
Yeah, I think it is a differentiator. It's interesting. I want to get back to one of my industry anecdotes that I gave on a consulting project that we were working on, that they were putting together a transparency initiative, and the marketing, quality, regulatory, and the communications folks and the sales folks looked around the room, and the procurement guy wasn't even in the room. It's connected. It needs to be connected, and you're only as strong as weakest link. Companies used to have vulnerable supply chains, and now there's an opportunity using technology and a variety of platforms that can turn that supply chain into a strength, and your systems of managing it and communicating it can be turned into strength. We're seeing some suppliers in the industry that are starting to do that and tell their stories in sustainability, everything else. This actually connects the actual entire supply chain. So this and technologies like this will be differentiators near into the future.
That's awesome. So, we touched upon it a little bit, but companies that invest in good process and technology, which inherently is what transparency is all about, what do you think is going to happen? Like, what are the first mover advantages? And I think a company like Gaia was one of the first movers. I think you mentioned some other brands that are taking initiatives. What are the advantages for companies to do it first, as well as the companies that are like the potential problems for companies that are late to the game?
Well, I think it's so is something like this a regulatory requirement? The answer is absolutely not. Does this? I mean, how many times, any of us have been in the industry, we know what we know, but how many times have we been confronted with, how do you know a product is good? Or how do you know which brand to buy from? Or how do you know authenticity? I mean, you get a story, but is it really authentic? This is one of those tools. I think it sets a benchmark. I think the early adopting companies on technology platforms such as this will have a differentiator. By itself, it won't dramatically, or it will not solely change their market position, but once there's a little bit of critical mass and talking about the use of technology this way, I think the barrier or the gap between the on-site companies and the not on-site companies, becomes wider and more apparent.
I have to imagine that this is going to create better value for a company, right? Companies are bought and sold all the time. It's going to increase company valuation. It's going to keep employee retention for companies that believe in products, especially millennials who are very value driven and want to be part of something bigger than themselves. Say, listen, man, I believe my product is helping people versus what is it doing, and attracting good talent from that side. I think there's so many additional benefits to integrating transparency in your business that it's just the right thing to do at the end of the day. So
I think, Joe, just let me interject there. I'm intrigued by the potential in the valuation delta. In any valuation, any deal structure, there's a due diligence process, and due diligence is examining the risks and the opportunities. A platform like this is risk management and also provides some opportunities for differentiation, so it can be woven very successfully into the deck and into the pitch.
Great. So we've got some Q&A here. Let me run through some of these. So let's see.
I'll actually take, I know, Ed, you've asked a bunch of questions. The first one about FSVP, Food Safety Modernization Act, I do not believe it's adequate, foreign or domestic. I don't believe they know what to audit. I don't believe there are enough qualified personnel to do FSVP. I know that there are initiatives to train. I know some of the ingredient companies have actually had their entire staffs trained on FSVP and FSMA and PCQI. And all of these are great initiatives, but it's inadequate. It's a vulnerability currently.
Good. Thank you for that answer too. So somebody asked a question. So how close is this system to being in place? Are you talking about? I assume you're talking about TagOne's platform, which is live and operational. So supplier can provide one set of data and not have to fill out 100, 400 different forms for companies. It's a good question. So basically, I think what you're referring to is like, hey, if one company sends out to a supplier and says, hey, can you provide this information? Can that be redundant for multiple suppliers? And the answer is yes. Can a participant set boundaries of what is private versus consortium? Our platform is a private blockchain, Steve. I guess if somebody else has their own blockchain, you probably have to merge them together with APIs on that side in order to have the two systems connect. But this is a total private blockchain on the TagOne side as well. Let's see. So let me see some other questions. What is the message or visual you want to show the consumer? Oh, I think I understand what you're saying, Steve. So on TagOne Connect, that is what you populate. So in many ways, we have some clients who are interested in just using the TagOne Connect platform and not the TagOne Enterprise solution. That is possible. You're going to give them what you want them to see. They're not going to see the whole supply chain going back all the way to the farmer and all the details. Consumers don't want to see that, and you certainly don't want to share that. So everything in the platform, you guys control with what consumers can and can't see on that side. So it's controllable and can be modified and customized in order to serve your needs, but obviously we can't customize the platform completely for everybody. So real quick, close with one more question or one more poll for everybody, which is maybe some different topics you guys would like to hear a little bit more about in the future. If you guys want to complete that. While they're filling that out, Len, in the meantime, if you could talk a little bit more about, about your company, how you help different organizations at these stages, and I've got your contact information up here too after the poll where people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, so going back to what we said a little bit earlier, we've developed that checklist of 16 items that we'd be urging companies of all sizes to make sure they have programs in place. We can assist that. We've also developed a trust transparency scorecard, which takes operational scores, supply chain partnership scores, culture scores, alignment scores, all into consideration and allows you to benchmark against similar organizations. That's a solution that Trust Transparency is bringing to the marketplace.
That's excellent. So real quick about TagOne, obviously you guys had a chance to learn a little bit more about our technology platforms. I mean, we just brushed upon them. If you want to get a deeper demo, just shoot me an email or give me a call. My information is down below. But we also do provide advisory services on these sides. Like, what do you do? Like, what's the roadmap in order to get up and running? How do we help people get their master data clean? So I'll share more information on that as well. I know we want to be mindful of our time. I think we're right up against 2 o'clock, which is perfect. I do want to thank everybody for joining us today. This webinar has been recorded. I'll find a way to share this, whether it's on our website. We'll post it there on our blog section so people can come listen and share in other different ways. And we're getting some feedback on the polls. And two of the more popular topics people would like to hear about are like, what are the key steps to get that supply chain transparency roadmap? Like, what do people need to do? So we can certainly have a topic on that. And then how tech and process can minimize regulatory risk and streamline audits. And then some people just want to get a closer look at our technology platform and demos. So, Len, any parting words for us before we let people get back to work?
Transparency is a journey. The outcome of transparency is trust. Trust is important to us as an industry. It's important to us as brands. And we need to use technology to facilitate and differentiate. So this is exciting opportunities, and looking forward to learning more.
That sounds great. Len, thank you so much for your time. There's a couple more questions that are on here that I may answer. Carissa, I'll reply back to you real quick. Thank you guys for joining us. I'll follow up with emails to everybody, or you can email me directly if you have any more questions. But I just want to thank you guys for your time and have an awesome day. Len, thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.